In the grand halls of power and the quiet corners of history, the stories of women who shaped 17th-century British politics have often been overlooked, tucked behind the names of kings, generals, and lawmakers. But these women were never just bystanders. They were thinkers, strategists, reformers, and rebels who left an indelible mark on their world. From royal courts to religious pulpits, from estate rooms to printed pages, they challenged expectations and redefined influence in ways that history is only beginning to fully recognize. Welcome to our channel, Words of Time, where we uncover the forgotten stories and untold voices that helped shape the past. In this video, we'll take you on a journey through the lives of remarkable women who defied the odds and challenged the norms of their era. We'll explore how they gained power, wielded influence, and transformed the political and social fabric of 17th-century Britain. From queens and countesses to writers and reformers, these are the unsung heroines who stood just beyond the spotlight but whose legacies still shine today. Let's begin. Throughout history, the role of women in royal courts has often been portrayed as ornamental, secondary, or limited to the domestic sphere. However, a deeper examination reveals a more complex and influential presence, one that operated behind the throne yet wielded considerable power. This influence, subtle and strategic, was executed not through formal authority but through familial ties, personal networks, and the exercise of soft power. Particularly in the early modern period of European monarchies, women in royal courts, whether queen's consort, noblewomen, or courtiers, played critical roles in shaping political events, navigating diplomatic waters, and even inciting or tempering rebellions. This world of covert political maneuvering, where influence rather than command defined one's reach, saw the emergence of powerful female figures who mastered the art of court politics. Their stories highlight the often overlooked channels through which women impacted governance and dynastic continuity. One such figure who embodies both the visible and hidden dimensions of female political power is Mary, Queen of Scots. As a queen regnant and not merely a consort, Mary occupied a unique position that granted her formal authority. Yet, it is not just her title but her strategic navigation of her gender, lineage, and personal alliances that underscore her influence in the court. Born in 1542 to King James V of Scotland and Mary of Guise, Mary became queen at just 6 days old, her father having died shortly after her birth. Her early years were marked by regency, and she was sent to France where she was educated and eventually married the Dauphin, who became King Francis II. Her time in France cultivated in her the refined political acumen necessary to navigate the complex interplay between courtly decorum and realpolitik. Mary's return to Scotland following the death of her husband signified a shift in her political standing. Though she resumed her role as monarch, she returned to a country torn by religious division and dominated by Protestant reformers. As a Catholic queen in a Protestant nation, her rule was inherently contentious. Despite these challenges, Mary sought to maintain a delicate balance between asserting her authority and accommodating political factions. Her marriages became focal points of political strategy. Her second marriage to Henry Stuart, Lord Darnley, was both a dynastic alliance aimed at strengthening her claim to the English throne and a source of internal court instability. Darnley's subsequent murder and her marriage to James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, who was widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's death, irreparably damaged her reputation. The political fallout from this marriage, coupled with increasing resistance from Scottish nobles, led to her forced abdication in favor of her son, James VI. Fleeing to England, Mary sought the protection of her cousin, Elizabeth I. Instead, she became a prisoner viewed by many as a legitimate Catholic claimant to the English throne and a threat to Elizabeth's rule. Her incarceration, lasting nearly 19 years, became a focal point of Catholic plots and international intrigue. Eventually, Mary's involvement, whether direct or circumstantial, in the Babington plot to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne, sealed her fate. Her execution in 1587 marked the end of a tumultuous career but solidified her legacy as a symbol of martyrdom and dynastic ambition. Mary's life and death illustrate the unique challenges and potential for influence that female sovereigns faced. Her political maneuvering, reliance on marriage alliances, and ability to command loyalty despite opposition demonstrate how royal women could exert power both within and beyond the confines of court protocol. Her impact extended even after her death, as her son, James VI of Scotland, would eventually ascend to the English throne as James I, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, a dynastic achievement deeply rooted in Mary's lineage. In contrast to Mary, Queen of Scots, who reigned in her own right, other influential women in court operated through the power afforded by their relationships to reigning monarchs. One of the most notable among these was Henrietta Maria of France, the queen consort of Charles I of England. Born in 1609 to Henry IV of France and Marie de' Medici, Henrietta Maria entered the English court under the banner of a politically strategic marriage designed to cement alliances between Protestant England and Catholic France. As a Catholic in a Protestant nation, she faced suspicion and hostility from the English populace and Parliament alike. Nevertheless, her position as Queen Consort did not prevent her from becoming a formidable political actor. Henrietta Maria's influence on Charles I was profound and often controversial. She was known to be a trusted advisor and confidant, whose counsel Charles relied on during pivotal moments of his reign. Her support of Catholic causes and attempts to secure religious toleration for English Catholics were viewed with deep suspicion by Protestant leaders and fueled anti-Catholic sentiment in the kingdom. However, beyond religious matters, Henrietta Maria wielded considerable influence over court appointments, patronage, and the king's policy decisions. Her circle at court became a center of loyalist sentiment, especially as tensions between the monarchy and Parliament escalated. During the English Civil War, Henrietta Maria's role evolved from that of a court influencer to an active political participant. She traveled to the Netherlands and France to raise funds and troops in support of the royalist cause. Her efforts included negotiating with foreign powers and managing royalist propaganda. These activities showcased her diplomatic skill and commitment to preserving the monarchy. Despite her efforts, the war ultimately ended in defeat for the royalists, and Charles I was executed in 1649. Henrietta Maria lived the rest of her life in exile, though she continued to advocate for the restoration of her son, Charles II. Henrietta Maria's political legacy lies in her resilience and strategic maneuvering during one of England's most turbulent periods. As a queen consort, she lacked formal political authority, but through her marriage, network, and personal initiative, she carved out a space of influence that extended well beyond courtly rituals. Her story is emblematic of the complex roles consorts could play, not merely as symbols of dynastic unity but as active agents in the survival and direction of monarchical rule. While figures like Mary, Queen of Scots, and Henrietta Maria had the advantage or burden of visibility due to their royal status, countless aristocratic women wielded power in more discreet yet equally impactful ways. They operated within an intricate web of courtly and noble networks, using their positions as wives, daughters, and patrons to influence decisions, broker alliances, and shape the contours of political power. These networks were not mere social clubs but strategic platforms for influence and negotiation. The salons, correspondence, and household patronage systems run by women allowed them to forge relationships with influential courtiers, diplomats, and clerics. Through these connections, women could act as intermediaries between competing factions, advocate for policies, or push for the advancement of family members. In many cases, noblewomen were responsible for organizing marriages that secured political alliances or resolved feuds. Their roles as mothers and educators of future monarchs or statesmen also gave them indirect but lasting political significance. Social circles, often underestimated in formal historical accounts, were crucial in shaping public opinion and policy within the court. Aristocratic women hosted events that served as both entertainment and platforms for political negotiation. These gatherings offered opportunities to advance causes, exchange intelligence, and reinforce loyalties. Women such as Lucy Hay, Countess of Carlisle, exemplify this phenomenon. A prominent figure during the reign of Charles I, she was known for her intelligence, charm, and ability to navigate shifting political tides. Though officially aligned with the royalist cause, she also maintained correspondence with leading parliamentarians, positioning herself as a valuable intermediary. The power of women's networks extended beyond national borders. Royal courts across Europe were interconnected through dynastic marriages, and women often acted as diplomats or informal emissaries between courts. Their correspondence reveals a high level of political awareness and engagement, often discussing matters of war, succession, and statecraft. In this context, women were not passive observers but dynamic participants in the international arena. Furthermore, court appointments such as ladies-in-waiting or governesses were not merely ceremonial. These positions offered unique access to monarchs and their families, allowing women to exert influence over decisions, counsel queens, and shape the education of future rulers. The intimacy of these roles meant that trust and loyalty could translate into significant political leverage. For example, Elizabeth Talbot, Countess of Shrewsbury, better known as Bess of Hardwicke, rose from modest beginnings to become one of the wealthiest and most influential women in Elizabethan England. Through a combination of strategic marriages and loyal service to the crown, including acting as custodian of Mary, Queen of Scots, she built a vast network of power and prestige. These female networks were not immune to conflict or betrayal, and their influence often came at great personal cost. Accusations of intrigue, sexual impropriety, or witchcraft were commonly used to undermine powerful women. Nevertheless, the persistence of these networks across generations underscores their importance in the political fabric of early modern Europe. Ultimately, the influence of women in royal courts was multifaceted and deeply embedded in the structures of power. Whether as queens, consorts, or noblewomen, their ability to navigate the nuances of court politics, form strategic alliances, and shape policy from behind the scenes reveals a dimension of political history that is both rich and complex. Far from being passive figures, these women were architects of political legacy, masters of diplomacy, and vital actors in the dynastic dramas that defined the era. Their legacies compel us to rethink the traditional boundaries of political authority and recognize the subtle, often invisible forces that have shaped history. Through marriages, networks, and personal agency, women at court influenced decisions that altered the course of nations. Their impact was not always recorded in official decrees or statutes, but it is inscribed in the outcomes of wars, the succession of monarchs, and the evolution of state institutions. To understand the true dynamics of historical power, one must look not only at the throne but also behind it, where women, in their diverse roles, crafted strategies, brokered peace, and fought for survival and influence in an often hostile political world. In the historical panorama of early modern England, the conventional narrative often highlights the public deeds of men monarchs, statesmen, and soldiers who stood at the helm of political decision-making. Yet behind these prominent male figures stood women who, although frequently excluded from formal positions of power, wielded profound influence in shaping political events, formulating strategies, and preserving or altering the trajectories of entire dynasties. Their roles as advisors, confidants, correspondents, and intermediaries reveal a world of subtle diplomacy, intellectual engagement, and emotional resilience. These women were not mere passive observers but active participants whose contributions were essential, if not always openly acknowledged. Through personal relationships, careful counsel, and the adept use of written correspondence, they guided, advised, and often corrected the course of actions undertaken by the men around them. Their influence was discreet, frequently hidden within private letters or domestic settings, but no less potent for its invisibility. Examining the lives of figures such as Anne Clifford, Lucy Hutchinson, and the wider phenomenon of politically charged correspondence by women illuminates the intricate web of female political engagement in a patriarchal society that persistently underestimated them. Anne Clifford, later Countess of Pembroke, Dorset, and Montgomery, offers an illuminating example of a woman who was both deeply embedded in the power structures of her time and unafraid to assert her agency within them. Born in 1590 to George Clifford, 3rd Earl of Cumberland, and Margaret Russell, and grew up in a world where noble women were expected to be dutiful daughters and compliant wives. However, she defied those expectations in significant ways, particularly through her lifelong pursuit of her rightful inheritance and her active role in advising and supporting her family members, especially her brother, during his brief inheritance and tenure as Earl of Cumberland. As a young woman, Anne Clifford displayed an intellectual rigor and emotional fortitude that would become the hallmarks of her life. She was well educated, fluent in classical literature and history, and maintained extensive diaries and records, which today provide invaluable insight into her life and the socio-political world she inhabited. Her father's decision to leave his estates not to her but to his brother's male heirs ignited a decade-long legal and familial struggle over her rightful inheritance. Though she was legally entitled to the estates as the only surviving child, the male preference primogeniture laws and political pressure thwarted her claims for much of her life. Despite these obstacles, Anne Clifford remained a constant presence in courtly and noble circles, where she frequently offered advice and support to her brother and other male relatives. She was particularly close to her brother Francis, and although he inherited the earldom, Anne's perspective on their ancestral estates and the proper administration of family affairs was taken seriously. She challenged legal interpretations, consulted with legal experts, and used her social position to influence judgments. Her letters and diaries indicate that she did not merely advise behind closed doors but engaged directly with lawyers and political figures to support her brother and uphold the family legacy. Even more impressive was her persistence after her brother's death, when she finally inherited the Clifford estates in 1643 after years of legal battles. In her later years, she took on the responsibilities typically reserved for male landowners, restoring castles, managing tenancies, overseeing legal affairs, and acting as patron to numerous churches and schools. Her role as an advisor in her younger years foreshadowed the authority she would later wield openly and with considerable competence. Through her lifelong efforts, and Clifford exemplifies the often overlooked political savvy and determination of noblewomen who, though officially disempowered, left a substantial imprint on their familial and political landscapes. In a different but no less compelling context, Lucy Hutchinson emerged during the turbulent years of the English Civil War as an intellectual partner and moral compass for her husband, Colonel John Hutchinson, a leading parliamentarian. Lucy was not only a chronicler of her husband's life and political contributions but also a philosopher, theologian, and strategist in her own right. Born around 1620 to a well-connected Puritan family, she was afforded an unusually thorough education for a woman of her time. Her marriage to John Hutchinson was not merely a domestic union but a political partnership that was grounded in shared convictions and mutual respect. Lucy Hutchinson's role extended far beyond the traditional duties of a wife. As a confidant and advisor, she helped shape her husband's political stance and supported his decisions through one of the most fraught periods in English history. When John Hutchinson served as governor of Nottingham Castle and later as a signatory to the death warrant of King Charles I, Lucy stood by him, offering not just emotional support but intellectual companionship. Her writings suggest a profound involvement in the ideological underpinnings of the parliamentary cause. She was deeply read in the classics, scripture, and contemporary political theory, and she frequently discussed these matters with her husband. After the monarchy was restored and John Hutchinson was imprisoned for his role in the regicide, Lucy again played an essential role, this time as a fierce advocate for his life and a chronicler of his moral character. Her memoir of his life, Memoirs of the Life of Colonel Hutchinson, remains one of the most important sources for understanding the motivations and inner lives of the parliamentarian elite. In it, she not only defends her husband's choices but also constructs a complex argument about loyalty, virtue, and divine providence, offering insight into her own deeply held beliefs and political awareness. Lucy Hutchinson's influence was both practical and philosophical. She supported her husband in strategic decisions, helped maintain order during his governorship, and provided him with the intellectual stimulation that sustained his resolve. More than a silent observer, she was a critical part of the decision-making process, albeit without formal recognition. Her role as a political strategist, moral anchor, and memoirist reveals the indispensable contributions that women made to the revolutionary politics of the 17th century, often from the shadows of prison cells, private homes, or makeshift fortresses. Beyond individual cases, a broader pattern emerges in the way women of the period used correspondence as a political tool to advise, influence, and form strategic alliances. In a time when public political engagement by women was constrained, the written word became a space of agency. Letters were not merely instruments of personal affection or familial news, they were vital tools in the circulation of ideas, the negotiation of power, and the management of political crises. Women across the social spectrum used correspondence to intervene in political affairs, sometimes acting as informal diplomats between rival factions or as mediators during family disputes that carried broader political implications. These letters were meticulously crafted to reflect loyalty, intelligence, and strategic subtlety. Aristocratic women in particular developed networks through their letters, engaging in sustained dialogues with members of court, parliament, and even foreign powers. Lady Rachel Russell, wife of William, Lord Russell, who was executed for his alleged involvement in the Rye House plot, used letters not only to advocate for her husband's life but also to shape public opinion about his political martyrdom. Her letters reveal a deep engagement with the political realities of her time and demonstrate a calculated effort to preserve her husband's reputation and their family's honor. Similarly, letters between queens, consorts, and noblewomen often included veiled references to political events and policy preferences, effectively turning personal correspondence into a tool of soft diplomacy. The tone and language of these letters varied depending on the audience. Some were direct appeals to monarchs or ministers, filled with persuasive rhetoric and moral reasoning. Others were more covert, employing metaphor and code to communicate across politically sensitive lines. In all cases, these letters served as lifelines for women who were otherwise excluded from formal channels of power. They allowed women to remain politically engaged, to advise their male relatives and allies, and to influence the outcomes of key decisions. Moreover, the very act of letter writing allowed women to construct public personas that suited their political purposes. By presenting themselves as loyal wives, concerned mothers, or humble petitioners, women could maneuver within the boundaries of societal expectations while still asserting their viewpoints. Their voices, preserved in volumes of private correspondence, offer a counter-narrative to the male-dominated historical record. What unites in Clifford, Lucy Hutchinson, and the anonymous or lesser-known women who wrote politically charged letters is a common thread of strategic intelligence, moral conviction, and enduring resilience. They operated within systems that systematically marginalized their voices, yet they found ways to be heard, to advise, and to shape the political discourse of their times. Their influence may not have always been public, but it was undeniably powerful. Their advice shaped policies, their alliances sustained movements, and their words carefully chosen and passionately written helped steer the course of history. These women remind us that power does not always announce itself with crowns, swords, or parliamentary decrees. Sometimes it resides in the whispered counsel of a sister, the written devotion of a wife, or the carefully plotted correspondence of a noblewoman determined to protect her family's legacy. They operated behind the scenes, behind the men whose names filled the chronicles of war and governance, but their impact was profound. In the quiet strength of their convictions and the subtlety of their strategies, they contributed not only to the political life of their own era but also to the evolving understanding of women's roles in shaping history. Their stories encourage a reassessment of how we define political action and who we consider to be political actors. For these women, influence was not a function of title or official appointment but of presence, intellect, and persistence. Whether advising a brother, guiding a husband, or writing to a monarch, they exercised power in ways that were at once intimate and far-reaching. Their words, preserved in diaries and letters, continue to speak across the centuries, testifying to the enduring legacy of women behind the men and often beside them who shaped the fate of nations. In early modern England, the public sphere encompassing political discourse, religious debate, and literary expression was largely constructed as a male domain. Yet, even within the constraints of patriarchal structures and societal expectations, women found ways to project their voices beyond domestic and courtly settings. Whether as monarchs, religious thinkers, or authors, they made significant contributions to shaping public opinion, influencing ideological developments, and expanding the boundaries of intellectual engagement. These contributions, though often mediated through expectations of decorum and piety, constituted an important and underappreciated dimension of public life. Far from being silent observers or passive participants, women acted as agents of change, advocates of reform, and creators of new forms of knowledge. Their voices articulated through speeches, sermons, tracts, plays, and poems challenged the limitations imposed upon them and revealed the complex interplay between gender, power, and expression in a society in flux. Elizabeth I stands as one of the most iconic figures of this period, not only because of her unprecedented status as a female monarch in a patriarchal society, but also because of her masterful engagement with the political and public discourse of her time. As queen regnant from 1558 to 1603, Elizabeth was uniquely positioned to shape national policy and identity through her voice and presence. However, what distinguishes her from many rulers is her exceptional ability to navigate gender expectations while exercising sovereign authority. Elizabeth's speeches to Parliament, her public addresses, and her carefully crafted correspondence reveal a woman deeply aware of the power of language and its potential to influence not just her court, but her entire nation. Elizabeth's relationship with Parliament was both strategic and performative. She recognized the need to work with this institution, especially in areas concerning taxation and national security, but she also jealously guarded her royal prerogative. In her speeches to Parliament, Elizabeth managed to assert authority while maintaining the humility expected of women in her era. Her famous speech to Parliament in 1601, known as the Golden Speech, is a prime example of this dual strategy. In it, she addressed concerns over monopolies, expressed her love and duty to her subjects, and reinforced the image of herself as a selfless ruler guided by the interests of her people. Though framed in language of affection and service, the speech was a powerful assertion of her political control and a deft means of maintaining loyalty among her legislators. What made Elizabeth's voice so compelling in the public sphere was her ability to use gendered language to her advantage. She often invoked her femininity when it suited her rhetorical aims, speaking of herself as a weak and feeble woman, only to contrast it with the strength of her mind and will. Her celebrated address to the troops at Tilbury in 1588, delivered in anticipation of a Spanish invasion, famously included the line, "I know I have the body of a weak, feeble woman, but I have the heart and stomach of a king and of a king of England too." This strategic deployment of gender not only bolstered her authority but also allowed her to engage in political discourse on her own terms. Elizabeth's presence in the public sphere was not an aberration but a model of how women could wield rhetorical power to influence national affairs. Beyond the monarchy, women's voices found resonance in religious discourse, especially during the seismic shifts of the Protestant Reformation and the rise of Puritanism. While institutionalized religion often relegated women to subordinate roles, the intense spiritual upheaval of the 16th and 17th centuries opened new spaces for female expression. The Reformation, with its emphasis on personal faith and scriptural literacy, encouraged greater engagement with religious texts. Women, newly empowered to read the Bible in the vernacular, became active participants in theological debates, sometimes publicly and often within their communities. Women such as Anne Askew and Mary Dyer became martyrs for their faith, and their stories exemplify how deeply women were involved in the religious movements of their time. Anne Askew, who was burned at the stake in 1546 for her Protestant beliefs, left behind a written record of her interrogations that reveals a sharp theological mind and a courageous spirit. Her insistence on the right to interpret Scripture independently challenged both ecclesiastical and gender hierarchies. Her voice, preserved through her own writings and those of contemporaries, became a powerful symbol of female agency within the Reformation. In the later Puritan movement, women played key roles in sustaining religious communities, organizing worship and disseminating ideas. Though often barred from formal preaching roles, many Puritan women conducted private meetings, offered spiritual guidance and wrote religious tracts. Figures such as Catherine Chidley, a staunch advocate for congregational independence, directly challenged the authority of male clergy and argued for the right of individual congregations led and maintained by men and women alike to govern themselves. Chidley's pamphlets, written in the 1640, articulate a coherent and forceful theological argument that not only defended her beliefs but also inserted her firmly into the public debates of her time. Puritan women also used their domestic authority to influence religious life. By managing the spiritual education of their children and household members, they shaped the next generation's values and beliefs. In this way, the home became a theological arena, and the woman's role within it, though ostensibly private, had profound public implications. Through prayer, discussion, and the teaching of Scripture, women extended their influence far beyond what traditional structures allowed. Perhaps nowhere is the expansion of women's voices into the public sphere more visible than in the realm of literature and drama. The rise of printing and the proliferation of pamphlets, poetry, and plays allowed women to reach audiences far beyond their immediate social circles. In doing so, they not only challenged the conventions of their time but also laid the groundwork for future generations of female writers and thinkers. Two of the most prominent figures in this literary awakening were Aphra Behn and Margaret Cavendish, both of whom defied expectations and used their pens to stake a claim in public discourse. Aphra Behn, often credited as the first professional female writer in English literature, was a dramatist, poet, and novelist who navigated the male-dominated world of Restoration theatre with remarkable success. Born in 1640, Behn worked as a spy for Charles II before turning to literature to support herself. Her works often dealt with themes of power, gender, and colonialism, and her playwriting career brought her into direct competition with male contemporaries. Her plays, including The Rover, offered complex female characters and sharp critiques of gender roles, often using wit and satire to expose the double standards of her society. Behn's success was groundbreaking not only because of her literary skill but also because she unapologetically claimed her right to write. In her prefaces and dedications, she defended her work against critics who accused her of impropriety or arrogance. She famously asserted that women should have the same freedom to write as men, challenging the notion that public authorship was inherently masculine. Through her boldness, Behn helped redefine what was possible for women in the literary public sphere. Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, was another trailblazing writer who refused to be constrained by the expectations of her sex. Born into a noble family in 1623, Cavendish was a prolific author of poetry, philosophy, fiction, and drama. She published under her own name, a rare and controversial act at the time, and engaged directly with the leading intellectual debates of her era. Her work, The Blazing World, a utopian novel published in 1666, is considered one of the earliest examples of science fiction. Through it, she explored themes of scientific discovery, political organization, and female authority. Cavendish was often ridiculed by her male contemporaries for her unconventional style and ambition, but she remained undeterred. In her philosophical writings, she grappled with questions of natural science, consciousness, and metaphysics, areas traditionally reserved for men. Her participation in these debates, often through epistolary exchanges and published treatises, represents a deliberate and courageous intervention into public intellectual life. Her insistence on being heard, even at the risk of scorn, helped carve out a space for female philosophical inquiry. Both Behn and Cavendish exemplify how the pen became a tool of empowerment for women who sought to engage with the world beyond their immediate households. Writing offered a means of participating in political, philosophical, and cultural debates without needing formal office or social sanction. These women and many others less well known expanded the boundaries of the public sphere by inserting their voices into print, thereby reaching readers across class, gender, and geographical boundaries. Their legacy is not only literary but also ideological. By asserting their right to speak, to think, and to be heard, they contributed to a broader redefinition of public life in which female voices could no longer be entirely excluded or ignored. Their work, in turn, inspired later generations of women to engage with the world through writing, activism, and political discourse. The stories of Elizabeth I and Askew, Catherine Chidley, Aphra Behn, and Margaret Cavendish represent only a fraction of the many ways women made their mark on the public sphere in early modern England. Despite legal, cultural, and religious constraints, these women found ways to challenge the norms, shape debates, and assert their intellectual and moral agency. Whether through the authority of the crown, the conviction of faith, or the creativity of the written word, they expanded the parameters of what it meant to be a public actor in a world that largely denied them a platform. Their voices remind us that history is not merely a record of laws passed and battles won, but also a tapestry of ideas, expressions, and challenges issued by those on the margins. The public sphere, far from being a monolith reserved for men, was constantly negotiated, shaped, and enriched by the women who dared to step beyond its boundaries. In doing so, they not only transformed their own lives but also altered the intellectual and cultural contours of their societies. Their legacy continues to resonate today, as we still grapple with questions of voice, authority, and inclusion in public discourse. The path they paved was not smooth or uncontested, but it was undeniably essential, and it remains a powerful testament to the enduring influence of women who refused to remain silent. In early modern Britain, the political sphere was widely assumed to be the domain of men, kings, lords, statesmen, soldiers. Power was imagined as a masculine force, tethered to notions of rationality, authority, and physical presence. Yet behind this deeply entrenched assumption lay a more nuanced and complex reality. Women, too, participated in politics, sometimes openly, often indirectly, but always meaningfully. The traditional stereotypes that relegated women to the private sphere or cast them as passive observers of history have long obscured the breadth of female agency. However, as we look more closely at the lived experiences, legal realities, and intellectual endeavors of women from the 16th to the 18th centuries, a different story emerges, one in which women not only challenged stereotypes but also forged paths to influence, power, and lasting legacy. A crucial entry point into this exploration is women's education and literacy, both of which played pivotal roles in enabling political engagement. Education for women in early modern England was not universally available, and for much of the population, literacy remained a privilege of the elite. Nevertheless, as religious reform and humanist ideals began to take deeper root in the 16th century, education for girls and women gained new cultural value. The Protestant Reformation in particular emphasized the individual's relationship to Scripture, necessitating a degree of literacy among believers. This theological shift opened new pathways for women to become literate and intellectually engaged, even if within a limited framework. Girls in noble and gentry families often received education in languages, music, and domestic management, but they were also taught to read and write in both English and Latin. Elizabeth I, for example, was not only fluent in multiple languages but also steeped in classical texts and political theory. Her education, championed by her stepmother Catherine Parr and shaped by humanist tutors, enabled her to engage directly with matters of state and diplomacy. Her case, while exceptional, reflected broader intellectual currents. A literate woman could not only read scripture and correspondence but could also engage with political ideas, participate in intellectual debates, and influence decisions through writing. As printing became more accessible, women of the upper and middling classes increasingly participated in the consumption and production of political literature. Diaries, letters, religious tracts, and political pamphlets served as tools through which women voiced their opinions and shaped the views of others. Literacy expanded the realm of influence, giving women an invisible seat at the political table. Though few women held formal office, many exercised soft power through written advocacy, the circulation of ideas, and the mentorship of their children and kin. Education became both a symbolic and practical resource for political engagement, enabling women to move from the periphery toward the center of intellectual life. The ability to read and write also allowed women to document their experiences and assert authority in subtle but profound ways. The memoirs and diaries of women like Lady and Clifford not only recorded the personal but also engaged with legal, economic, and political issues. Clifford's famous battle to reclaim her inheritance and extended legal and political campaign waged over decades revealed both her deep literacy and her command over the written word. She marshaled genealogies, legal documents, and personal correspondence to construct a public argument about her right to property, one grounded in both historical precedent and contemporary law. Her literacy was not simply a personal skill but a political weapon, used to challenge gender norms and assert rightful agency. Property rights represented another vital arena in which women could challenge stereotypes and wield political power. Although English common law famously rendered married women as femme covert, their legal identities subsumed under those of their husbands, this did not mean that women lacked control over property altogether. Widows, single women, and even some married women with jointures or dower rights could own, inherit, and manage land and resources. These legal footholds, though circumscribed, gave women leverage in both familial and political negotiations. In practice, control over property could translate into significant influence. Land ownership brought with it authority over tenants, participation in local economies, and often, indirect involvement in political affairs. Women who managed estates or served as heads of households were frequently involved in the resolution of disputes, the supervision of agricultural production, and the distribution of resources within their communities. Their decisions had tangible consequences and shaped local power dynamics. While this influence was rarely acknowledged in official records, it was deeply felt by those within their domains. Moreover, property was often entangled with inheritance disputes and dynastic politics, drawing women into legal battles that had broader political ramifications. The aforementioned case of Lady and Clifford offers one such example, as does the legal activism of women like Margaret, whose 15th-century letters reveal a keen understanding of property law, family politics, and the workings of the court. Women who engaged in these disputes were not only protecting their personal interests but also asserting a vision of lineage, continuity, and rightful authority. In doing so, they reshaped the meaning of property as a source of female agency. Beyond the local and familial, property rights also allowed some women to support political causes and religious movements. Wealthy widows and heiresses could endow schools, fund pamphlets, and provide safe houses for dissenters. During the English Civil War, for instance, numerous aristocratic women used their estates to shelter parliamentarian or royalist forces, depending on their allegiance. Their ability to marshal resources and offer logistical support gave them an indispensable role in the conflict. Far from passive bystanders, these women were active participants in the national crisis, leveraging property for political ends. Even as many women operated within private or semi-private realms, their influence on politics and society was enduring. One of the most significant aspects of women's political participation was their role in shaping future generations through education, upbringing, and social networks. The domestic sphere, often dismissed as apolitical, was in fact a crucible for the formation of political values. Mothers, governesses, and tutors played key roles in instilling political ideologies in their children, many of whom would grow up to hold office or command armies. The ideological legacy of women thus extended far beyond their own lifetimes. This intergenerational influence was particularly evident in the context of political and religious reform. Puritan women, for example, were instrumental in cultivating a culture of dissent and moral rigor within their households. By teaching their children to read the Bible, participate in prayer, and embrace principles of godly living, these women laid the foundations for political resistance and religious nonconformity. The so-called godly household was both a religious and political unit, and women were often at its ideological center. The cultural memory of powerful women also played a crucial role in legitimizing female political agency. Figures such as Elizabeth I and Boudica became symbols of national pride and political strength, invoked in later centuries by women's rights advocates and writers seeking to challenge patriarchal norms. The legacy of women who had wielded power, whether through the crown, the pen, or the purse, offered inspiration and precedent for future generations. These historical memories, preserved in literature, portraiture, and popular lore, helped construct a genealogy of female strength that could be drawn upon in moments of political crisis or change. Even in the 18th century, when Enlightenment rationalism and early industrial capitalism introduced new forms of gender stratification, women continued to assert political influence. Bluestockings like Elizabeth Montagu and Hannah More used salons, essays, and philanthropy to advocate for reform and education. While they operated within accepted gender norms, their work subtly pushed the boundaries of the public sphere. Their advocacy for women's education, prison reform, and the abolition of slavery placed them squarely within the most pressing political debates of their day. Their voices, though often moderated by expectations of feminine decorum, contributed to the shaping of national consciousness and policy. The 18th century also saw the emergence of early feminist thought, much of it grounded in the very educational and legal inequalities that women had long contested. Writers like Mary Estelle and Mary Wollstonecraft challenged the philosophical underpinnings of female subordination, arguing for rational equality and the expansion of women's rights. Estelle's A Serious Proposal to the Ladies called for the establishment of a women's college, while Wollstonecraft's A Vindication of the Rights of Woman made a radical case for political and educational equality. These women were not merely responding to personal grievances, they were engaging with Enlightenment principles to demand inclusion in the public sphere. What united these diverse expressions of female agency, whether through literacy, property, or ideological legacy, was a persistent refusal to accept the limitations imposed by gender norms. Women in early modern Britain found myriad ways to participate in politics, often by reinterpreting or subtly resisting the roles prescribed to them. Their contributions, though frequently undocumented or undervalued by contemporaries, laid the groundwork for future transformations in British society. Today, the enduring impact of these women is visible not only in historical scholarship but also in the broader understanding of political participation. By challenging stereotypes and asserting their agency, they expanded the definition of politics to include forms of influence beyond the ballot box or parliamentary bench. Their lives and legacies remind us that politics is not confined to public office but is woven into the fabric of education, property, family, and discourse. The story of women's political participation in early modern Britain is thus not a marginal one, it is central to the very development of British political culture. In reframing the narrative to include these women, we not only do justice to their memory but also enrich our understanding of how power works subtly, indirectly, and often through unexpected channels. Their agency was real, their participation meaningful, and their influence lasting. The political history of Britain cannot be told fully without them. The political history of 17th-century Britain is often told through the lens of monarchy, war, parliament, and male leadership. Dominated by towering male figures Charles I, Oliver Cromwell, Charles II, James II, William III, it is easy to believe that women played only marginal roles in shaping the turbulent politics of the age. Yet this narrative, while powerful and long-standing, fails to capture the complexity and nuance of a society in which women consistently engaged with, influenced, and at times directly shaped the political currents of their era. Unveiling the contributions of these women does not require invention or speculation, it simply requires a different perspective, one that sees power as multifaceted and influence as not confined to the formal structures of office. As we consider the broad array of women who participated in shaping 17th-century Britain, a fuller and more inclusive story begins to emerge, one that restores to the record the unsung heroines whose labor, intellect, and courage played vital roles in the making of their world. Across court politics, domestic affairs, religious movements, and intellectual life, women acted with intention and influence. Queen consorts such as Henrietta Maria played central roles in the political decision-making of their husbands. As the wife of Charles I, Henrietta Maria was far from a passive figurehead. A devout Catholic in a Protestant kingdom, she was blamed for radicalizing the king and pushing him toward absolutist policies. Yet she was also a diplomat and negotiator, corresponding with foreign courts, raising funds and armies in Europe during the Civil War, and sustaining the royalist cause even during exile. Her presence in English politics was both symbolic and deeply practical. She shaped alliances, maneuvered within the court, and left an imprint on public opinion for better or worse. Another woman of royal lineage who profoundly shaped the political climate of her time was Mary, Queen of Scots. Though her most politically active years occurred in the 16th century, her execution in 1587 reverberated through 17th-century British politics, especially during the reign of her son, James I. Mary's death solidified her as a Catholic martyr in the eyes of many, and the symbolic weight of her legacy continued to haunt Protestant England. Her life and tragic end underscored the persistent anxiety about female sovereignty, religious affiliation, and legitimacy, issues that would remain central in the political tensions of the 17th century. Her story was invoked repeatedly by both supporters and detractors of powerful women who followed her. While queen consorts and royals had a visible platform from which to exert influence, aristocratic and gentry women often shaped politics through more subtle but equally powerful means. Lady Anne Clifford stands as a particularly striking example. Her long and relentless legal battle to claim her rightful inheritance was not only a personal victory but also a political act that defied gendered expectations. She kept detailed records, managed extensive estates, and leveraged her position to sponsor churches, schools, and infrastructure in northern England. Her writings reveal a woman who was deeply aware of her social and political position, and who consciously cultivated a legacy that would endure beyond her lifetime. The battlefield of inheritance and land was not the only domain in which women demonstrated agency. During the English Civil War, many women aligned themselves with royalist or parliamentarian causes, providing resources, shelter, and even acting as spies or messengers. Lucy Hutchinson, wife of the parliamentarian Colonel John Hutchinson, was one of many women who not only supported but actively shaped their husbands' political trajectories. Her memoirs reveal a woman of intense political conviction and sharp intelligence, whose loyalty to the Republican cause was matched by a profound commitment to the intellectual ideals that underpinned it. Through her writings, she preserved and interpreted a key chapter of British history, adding depth and nuance that would otherwise be lost. Other women used the power of the written word not only to document but to persuade, argue, and reform. The 17th century saw the emergence of women as public intellectuals and authors, figures like Aphra, Behn, and Margaret Cavendish, who broke through the constraints of genre and gender to voice their views on politics, science, society, and war. Behn, often celebrated as the first professional female writer in English literature, brought political themes into her plays and novels, critiquing colonialism, gender roles, and monarchical power. Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, used philosophy, poetry, and prose to explore human nature, governance, and women's place in intellectual life. Her audaciousness in publishing under her own name, debating male philosophers, and envisioning alternative societies was a radical act of political imagination. The public expression of political ideas by women was not limited to the literary elite. Women in religious movements, particularly in Puritan and Quaker circles, played instrumental roles in shaping spiritual and social discourse. The Reformation had long opened the door to increased female engagement with religious texts, but the Civil War and its aftermath created new opportunities for women to preach, write, and organize. Figures such as Margaret Fell, one of the founders of the Quaker movement, advocated for gender equality in spiritual leadership, challenging both ecclesiastical and political hierarchies. Women who preached, published tracts, or held meetings risked persecution, imprisonment, and public censure, but they also laid the groundwork for broader challenges to patriarchal structures in society and government. Religious activism was closely tied to literacy and education, which played foundational roles in enabling women's political participation. The ability to read the Bible, interpret legal texts, or draft correspondence gave women tools to act strategically and assert their views. Education was more than a private benefit, it was a gateway to public engagement. Throughout the century, increasing numbers of women, particularly among the gentry and merchant classes, learned to read and write. They kept diaries, exchanged letters, and sometimes even participated in political pamphlet debates, all of which expanded the scope of women's voices in the national discourse. The power of correspondence was especially significant. In a world where political alliances were often maintained through kinship and communication, women's letters served as crucial instruments of diplomacy and persuasion. Their epistolary networks enabled them to coordinate support, influence decisions, and mobilize resources. These private documents were sometimes even intercepted and used as evidence of political scheming, which underscores their power and perceived threat. Through correspondence, women could operate in a shadow realm of politics, one not visible in official records but no less impactful. Women's involvement in shaping politics was not merely reactive or auxiliary. Many women exercised long-term influence through the way they shaped ideology, nurtured political consciousness in their households, and cultivated networks of mutual support. The so-called private sphere of home and family was in fact a crucible of political formation. Mothers and guardians transmitted values, taught literacy, and prepared future leaders. Their role in forming the next generation of thinkers, officers, and legislators gave them indirect but far-reaching political clout. Property, education, religion, correspondence, literature, and legal battles, these were the many tools by which women entered the political realm. Each of these avenues allowed them to wield power, even as formal office remained beyond reach. They managed estates, governed communities, influenced policy debates, led religious movements, and shaped political ideologies. Often their power was informal and their influence overlooked, but it was nonetheless real. They were advisors, strategists, financiers, activists, and thought leaders. These unsung heroines shaped the world not through the sword or the throne but through intellect, resilience, and vision. Their contributions remind us that political history is not merely a record of legislation and war, it is the story of influence, of choices made and voices raised. These women lived within constraints, yes, but they also transcended them. They found ways to matter, to speak, to lead. Their lives complicate the notion of passive femininity that so often haunts historical narratives, offering instead a portrait of dynamism, strength, and purpose. In revisiting their stories, we not only recover lost voices but also challenge the frameworks through which history has been written. The invisibility of these women in many standard accounts of 17th-century Britain is not a reflection of their insignificance but of historiographical neglect. As scholars and readers begin to engage more deeply with women's writings, court records, property documents, and religious tracts, a richer picture of the period begins to emerge, one in which women are not merely accessories to male action but agents in their own right. To honor their legacy is not to retroactively anoint them with titles or roles they never claimed but to understand and appreciate the many ways they navigated, influenced, and changed their world. It is to value their intellect, to acknowledge their courage, and to recognize their endurance. It is to rewrite the history of 17th-century Britain with the inclusion it always deserved. Their influence continues to echo not just in the reforms and shifts they helped to usher in, but in the very questions they compel us to ask about power, gender, and historical memory. Who gets remembered? Who is seen as political? What counts as participation? These questions, spurred by the lives and actions of women centuries ago, remain relevant today. They invite us to think more critically and more inclusively about what history is and who makes it. The women of 17th-century Britain, whether queens or countesses, pamphleteers or poets, preachers or property holders, played indispensable roles in shaping their society. Their legacy is not confined to a footnote in a textbook or an occasional festival of commemoration. It is woven into the fabric of British political culture itself. They were not silent, they were not passive, and they were not marginal. They were present, active, engaged, and consequential. They deserve to be remembered not as shadows behind the men but as vital forces in their own right. In reclaiming their stories, we do not only restore justice to the past, we also enrich the present with a fuller understanding of the human capacity to lead, to influence, and to endure.